All right, well, welcome to this new semester. We're talking this time about biblical leadership. That's what we'll be going through now. This is going to happen again, so okay, we'll do it this way. So here's a lesson outline. First lesson is going to be what is biblical leadership. Second lesson, we'll look at the leadership of Moses. Then we'll look at David, Paul, and of course Jesus Christ, the ultimate leader. And we'll look at what it means to be a servant leader, how leadership applies in the church, and then how we go about applying what we've learned here into our lives and our ministries and whatever else we'll be doing, our families, etc. And then there'll be the infamous final exam. So, and one thing in your courseware there, you notice there is an essay requirement, and there is one, but the way it's described in there sure doesn't look to me like it belongs to this course.
No, it looks like it belongs to Paul's letter to the Romans.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I contacted Paul about that one, and he's double checking, but with the school. But it looks like that definitely is going to need a redefinition as to what the essay is supposed to be. So we won't talk about essay at this point.
Is there any recommended reading with this?
I haven't seen any. There actually are some pretty good books out there, but maybe I'll see if I can put together a list of some good books on leadership. Well, when we think about leadership, basically, we're all led or we're going to be a leader at some point in our life. A lot of times we're both. We're led in one situation and we're leaders in another. And that can be either directly, like at work, you're led by your boss. Hopefully you're led by your boss, not bossed by your boss. There's a difference between a leader and a boss. Or it might be indirectly, by somebody that you admire, that you look up to, or when we're leading, we might not even know it directly. We got the people that we're leading in our ministries, but there might be somebody that's actually looking up to you and you're leading them indirectly. So we have it that way. And leadership has an awful lot to do with influence. You can look at it, as really its influence is much more important than what you would call leadership, or what a lot of people consider leadership. And one advantage, though, of having the title of leader is often that gives you the opportunity to use the influence for people that don't have any influence, which is something that basically, you're all doing by doing what you're doing in the motel ministry. You're out there, you get a chance to influence them, and by bringing the stories back to your churches and the people you meet, then you're influencing that. When you guys were talking just before we started this, heard somebody mentioning Lee Strobel that spoke, this weekend. And one of his stories was about a fellow that had been homeless. In fact, he was in such bad condition that even the other homeless people didn't want to be around him. But he got turned around. He's now a pastor. The mayor of Las Vegas comes to him to find out how to handle the homeless situation there in Las Vegas. So there's a case where now he's got this leadership position as a pastor, but his influence is going much beyond that, much past his church that he's a congregation of. He's influencing the homeless that he still serves, but he's also influencing the whole city and how they're going to handle the problem. So that's a really good example of how influence and leadership can be tied together. And then we're going to be looking quite a bit at the contrast between what the courseware calls conventional leadership and biblical leadership. Now, what you might find is actually, if you're looking at people that are out there, in the secular world, doing what they consider conventional leadership, you find out that a lot of them are actually using biblical principles of leadership, the ones that are successful, but they might not even know it. But you look at the successful ones, and you'll find out that a lot of what they're doing is based on biblical leadership concepts, not the ones that some of the leadership gurus that you might find out there are proposing. This is an interesting little quote that I found in one of the books I was looking at here. It's, great leaders inspire us to go places we would never go on our own and to attempt things we never thought we had in us. Now, again, I think, because of the motel ministry, I don't think any of you people thought you'd probably be doing this when you first thought about doing some ministry. And then once you even got into it, you say, okay, I hear a lot of people saying, yeah, I just thought I'd go along and, help out, help serve the breakfast or do something. But then somebody approached me about leading one of these motel churches. I never thought I'd be doing that.
Yeah,
What?
I remember back when I was first getting started at doing that, I was down at Santa Ana. And there we actually split things up because of the way the motel didn't particularly want some of the homeless that were coming back on their property. So there was one out back for the motel guests and then one out front for the homeless people that would show up. And it was right on First Street. And I used to joke that my congregation changed every time the light changed. But I was sitting there thinking it, and I said, I never really thought I'd be a street corner preacher when I got into this. But that's where he had me at the time. So you find out that, great leaders inspire us to go do things that we didn't think we were capable of or that we never even thought that we were going to be doing. Another quote here about leadership. Leadership, it's basically about going somewhere. If you're not going somewhere, you really don't need a leader. But if you find out that you and your people, don't know where you're going, then your leadership really doesn't matter. And that's one of the things that leaders really have to focus on. Is part of being a leader is setting the vision for where you're going. And to do that, of course, you've got to understand the people that you're leading, and you've got to understand what God's will is for where He wants you to lead. But then you look at a couple other interesting ones here. This first one's from John Maxwell. It says, if you're leading others and you're lonely, then you're not doing it right. Think about it. If you're all alone, that means nobody is following you. And if nobody is following you, then you're not really leading. Kind of puts a hole in that old thing you hear about, about it being lonely at the top. If it's lonely, you're probably not doing something right. And another version of this that I've heard a lot is if you think you're leading and no one is following you, then you're only taking a walk. I've heard that from a lot of people, and actually as I was looking it up today, it said it's actually an Afghan proverb. So it goes even beyond, different cultures. So that's kind of interesting. A lot of people find themselves in this position. A lot of them will look back and see nobody, and then they'll just figure, oh, well, they must be taking a break. I know I'm really leading, but they're not really doing it. So let's take a quick look at what they're calling conventional leadership. It's probably what most of us are used to. It's what we see out there in the secular world. It's what most leadership books and courses and whatever else are pointed towards. But it's not necessarily what we're looking for here. We're going to be contrasting what most conventional leadership says to what biblical leadership says. So this is what I say, you'll see this in business, you'll see this in government, and unfortunately you'll see some of these conventional leadership things going on in some of our churches too, unfortunately. Where they should be following biblical leadership, some churches get a little confused and tend to be more towards the business side than they are for the God side. Conventional leadership, generally it's tied to a position or a title. Somebody, either appoints you to that point or you've appointed yourself to that point. It's pretty much the whole chain is about achieving that title or that level of power. And in conventional leadership, power is pretty much what it's about. You look at it, and that's what they're really trying to get. Now, as we said, the ones that are really successful out there in the world, doing the secular side, a lot of them are actually doing biblical leadership, but they don't know it because they haven't seen it, actually following in the Bible. But they've heard these things and they've seen somebody else maybe that it worked for, and they're applying it. So not all conventional leadership follows, what we're going to be seeing in here as the examples. And it doesn't always get as bad as some of the worst ones that we've seen. As we say, it's pretty much all self-defined. You look at it, I mean, if you go walking into any bookstore, if anything like that still exists, or hop onto Amazon, and you look into the section on management, there's probably, rows and rows, or in the case of Amazon, pages and pages and pages of how to do management books. It's one place I used to work. We used to joke that, our management was done by the book of the month, management book of the month club. It seemed like every time a new book on management came out, that's what, our management decided was the way to do things. And we'd, okay, now we're going to change it to do this. Now we're going to follow this method. And it kind of got comical after a while. Conventional leadership can often be dictatorial. That's when things go really, really wrong with conventional leadership. So, you think this dictatorial, but they take about the power. You look at it, you see that, in the governments and around the world. It's happened, all in history. A lot of them tend to go dictatorial. Then if you look at it and you look at everything and you think, really, there's only one person who was ever qualified to actually be dictatorial if he wanted to be. And that was Jesus Christ when he was on earth. But he didn't. But he was probably, he's the only one qualified because he has all the answers. All these other dictators only think they have all the answers. But, as we're going to see when we look at biblical leadership, Jesus didn't do that. He led the way that he wants us to lead. A lot of people, when they get to this point, you'll see them and you hear it a lot. It's my way or the highway. Bosses get in there and they say, you're going to do it this way, I don't care. Or the proverbial, don't confuse me with the facts, my mind's already made up.
Then there's those that are master manipulators.
Mm-hmm.
And that can be very deceiving, for sure.
Right, yeah. Manipulation, in your coursework, there's a lot, of expansion on this. I didn't really want to put it all up there because it didn't really make much sense to, duplicate everything that's there. But one of the things that they talk about, is a lot of conventional leadership is manipulation, coercion, whatever, to try to get people to do things that you want them to do that they don't necessarily want to do. To get them to do it your way, and even though it may not be the right way. So we see that a lot. Thing we also notice when it gets dictatorial, eventually it always is going to turn out bad. It might not be for a while, but eventually it always does. The businesses are eventually going to fail. The dictatorship is going to fall, whatever. It eventually is going to go bad. It might take a long time, but it is going to go bad. Now this actually is straight out of your courseware. Thought it was just a nice summary of all the other stuff that was in there. One thing I was thinking of when I was preparing this was it's kind of interesting to me that the night we're looking at conventional leadership happens to be the night the Oscars are on. And sometimes the entertainment industry can be an example of the way conventional leadership should not be done. You think about it. How many, since the first of the year, how many award shows have there been on? Because one of the things it talks about in here is, personal rewards. How many award shows have been on where basically they've been telling themselves how wonderful they are? So I just thought it was kind of interesting that it worked out that way. But conventional leaders, they're self-appointed, or they're appointed by other humans. They're self-led. Again, this is pretty much, the leaders, especially as they get higher and higher in the leadership chain, they're going to go with whatever works for them, whatever they think is the best way to lead. They're not necessarily going to be following the biblical things that we want to see, or even anything that some of the better secular and conventional leaders propose that actually work. It's self-dependent. They're going to rely on their own personal efforts, their own instincts, their talents, knowledge, education, wealth, heredity. Obviously, in the things where there still are monarchies existing in the world. It's your leadership just because you happen to be, the son or daughter of the king, queen, whatever that particular country has for their reigning monarch. In a lot of businesses, it's just because you happen to be the son of the founder or the CEO. So sometimes it's just, you get there by heredity. It's a lot of self-focus. Most conventional leaders that again, like I say, these are not all of them, but the ones where things are going bad, they self-glorify. It's like, look at me. They get really, really enthused with their own titles. It's like, do you know who I am? Type thing. Like that should give, special treatment. Defined by what they have won or their possessions. The bumper sticker, he who dies with the most toys wins. No, he who dies with the most toys still dies. It's what happens after that that's important. Because either direction you go, you're not taking your toys with you. It's temporal power, all about status and title. Personal rewards, seeking recognition from others. Material success, again, the most toys, the most money, and it's generally selfish. Want to leave a personal legacy, and their dreams are paramount. Now, again, like I said, it's not all the case. You see a lot of people out there that are, in secular leadership that are actually doing some really good things with their money, and that's good. But here we're looking at, the things that can really go wrong with conventional leaders. And as we mentioned earlier, they often use others to achieve their goals through manipulation or whatever way they can get it done. It's kind of the old, doesn't matter who you step on the way up as long as you get there. Now we're going to look at biblical leadership. Biblical leadership is God-defined. God defines the way it should be. He's the best example of what leadership is. It's what we should be seeing in our churches and in our ministries. Like I said, unfortunately, sometimes we don't always see that. It's tied to the example of Jesus. When Jesus was here on the earth, we look at him, and that's going to be one of our studies in a few weeks, is looking at Jesus as a leader and the way he led, because that's the way we should all be doing it. And it really focuses on caring for God's people. So it makes a lot of difference between the conventional and the biblical. A lot of conventional leaders really don't care about the people they're leading as long as they get done what they want to get done. Biblical leadership realizes that, you're leading God's people, and it's your job to take care of them and to make sure that they're getting what they need. We look at the summary from your coursework again. God does the appointment, not self-appointed. God-led, Spirit-led. You're following God's leadership, not your own leadership. It's God-dependent. Basically, you have to depend upon God to get things done, to provide the methods, the tools, the resources. How many times in the motel ministry have you guys said, man, I don't know where this is going to come from. We need this, or we need this, or we need that, or we don't have enough volunteers. And you say, God, it's your ministry. Bring them in. And sure enough, they show up. I even remember it was just the rain today reminded me of when we were doing this down at Santa Ana again. I don't know how many times there'd be rain all the way around, and we'd be standing there in the parking lot, completely dry, and you could see it raining all the way around. And as soon as we were done with the ministry, it started raining there. It's like God was holding back the rain from that one spot so we could get it done. It's amazing. And just some of the stories that I've heard from you guys and from Ron and others of how things were needed, and then they just kind of showed up. It's amazing. That's one good way to know that you're doing something, you're doing it right the way God wants when that stuff happens. You get expand the kingdom. That's the main thing. Pretty much everything's going to be kingdom based. So it's bringing people in. It's not all. Not only churches are the ones that bring people to Christ. A lot of ministries do. A lot of people that are just leaders because of because of the influence that they have, because of the position they're in. People see them and then make a difference. Focuses on the spiritual power, not on the temporal powers. It's basically not what is it? I think it was Mao said power comes from the end of a gun. That was his idea of what power was. But it's no, God is the source of power. Focuses on serving others, self-sacrificing and shepherding. Actually, we get into the next one, we're going to look at a little bit more about shepherding. Actually do a lot of teaching and empowering of others when you're doing biblical leadership. It's not so much focused on your success. A lot of it is focusing on helping other people get to their success. Again, like in our ministries here, when you guys are out leading the motel, the whole point is to get these motel churches so that they can function on their own. So part of what you guys are doing out there is building up leaders among the people that are there. That's biblical leadership. A lot of times, as a biblical leader, one of your jobs is to put yourself out of a job. And that's the goal of the motel ministries, is eventually we want it so that they can take it over and we don't have to be there to do it for them. You got success at bringing others to Christ. How many people have done that already, from the motel ministry? People, I've heard stories of people that were so dead set against going that they weren't going to go. But then maybe one of their relatives, or one case I heard, it was a guy that was like a big burly biker dude, and said he'd never set foot inside a church, but his wife started going. Then he said, "Oh well, I'll go and listen to the music at least." Then he started staying for the message. Then he finally gave his life to Christ. It's amazing what can happen in these things, but that's another indication. If you're seeing people coming to Christ because of what you're doing, you're following biblical leadership principles. And then all the activities are motivated by love. And this is just a little chart that I kind of put together. Try to summarize it in as a few things as possible. So basically in one column I've got there, what God does in the development of leaders, and the other side is the characteristics that are needed by the leaders. So the first thing is that God selects the leader. Well, the leader has to be available. You have to make yourself available. Here am I, send me type thing. A lot of people, just say, no, I'm too busy. I just can't do this. So if you're not available, God can't use you. He might not, oftentimes he doesn't pick the one that's got the most talent or the most ability in an area. He picks the person that's available. And then he can make them what he needs into a leadership. Which brings us to the second thing. God trains and equips the leaders. Which means that the person that's going to be the leader has to be teachable. If you're not willing to listen to what God wants you to do and the way he wants you to do it, then he's not going to be able to use you as a leader. You're not going to be able to follow the biblical leadership characteristics. And at some point, after he's trained you and equipped you, he's going to deploy you. He's going to say, okay, you're ready, go start doing it. Which means you got to be able to listen and follow. You got to, first of all, be still enough to listen to see what he wants you to do. Then you have to be willing to follow his rules and the way he wants it done and not yours, even when a lot of times it might not make sense in what you consider conventional wisdom. You might go, this is the craziest thing I ever heard. You know, how many times have you heard somebody give a testimony on that? They said, yeah, God, I just felt God told me to do this. It was the craziest thing I ever heard, but I had enough faith and trust in him that I was going to follow him and obey. And wow, how this turned out is amazing. And then once he's got you out there leading, he's going to guide you and help you along, which means you got to be humble and you got to have all the above also. Because one of the things is your first deployment probably isn't where you're going to be. He's going to move you on up. And as he moves you up, you're going to have to be available again. And in order to be available, you got to be willing to give up the position you're in. And it's a lot easier to give up that position if you've already trained somebody to take over. So that's, again, part of what you're doing then, is you're doing some of the training and equipping as you're being a biblical leader. So then he moves you up into the next level of leadership. Okay, you're going to be doing things you hadn't done, so he's going to have to teach you and prepare you. He's going to get you into that, and he just keeps, you can have a nice little cycle going here. So you have to have all of these things, and you have to have it all the time. It's not like you say, okay, whew, I'm done with that part. No more learning. I don't have to be teachable anymore. Like, nope, you always have to be learning. And I've heard, Rick Warren say it a lot, that all leaders are learners. I've heard that from a lot of other sources too. So once you stop learning, you probably are going to stop leading because you got nothing else to give. You have to keep learning new things. Okay, and then another little comparison that I came up with here between conventional and biblical leadership. Biblical leadership is often illustrated by a shepherd. Several of the leaders we're going to look at, we've seen in the times, actually started out as shepherds. Moses worked as a shepherd when he was off in Midian. David was a shepherd. And, of course, Jesus is called the Great Shepherd. So I was thinking about using that illustration as a way to contrast conventional and biblical leadership and to look at the way the two perceive the sheep. Well, the bad part of conventional, again, they like to say not all conventional leaders are this way, but a lot of them say, they look at the sheep as the sheep are something to be sheared. We're just going to take from them what we can get from them, and that's it. Basically, as a leader, what can I get from the sheep? What can they do for me? Not what can I do for them, what can they do for me? How can the sheep make my position more important? Basically, if I got a whole lot more sheep, I'm a lot more important. Get as many sheep under me as possible. You see that in a lot of companies where, you call them, the empire builders that you see in a lot of companies. They try to just build their little empire and get more people in whether they need them or not. And basically, a lot of the really bad conventional leaders, they really don't care what happens to the sheep as long as they get what they want. Well, now we look at in biblical leadership, the sheep are to be cared for. That's the whole job of a shepherd, is to care for the sheep. You lead them from the front. Like somebody said, you can't push sheep. You have to lead them. Kind of got an example of that once upon a time. I had an uncle that had a farm. He was older, so he was renting out a lot of his land to somebody that was actually doing the farming on it with the corn. But he had a couple fields that they really couldn't plant corn in. So a lot of times, if some of his neighbors had too many sheep, he'd just say, "Okay, you can put them out in this field." Well, it happened to be a field that I used to play in a lot when I was out there. So I'd go out there and play, and I was out there one night fairly late, just as it was getting dark. So they called me, it's time to go home. So I start walking from that field back to home, and it's dark. And as I'm walking up there, and I hear this rumble, rumble, rumble. Stop, wait a minute, what's that? Take off again, rumble, rumble, rumble. What's that? The sheep. I was moving, they were following. So, sheep, you have to lead from the front. They're if somebody's leading, they're going to follow. It doesn't really matter who it is, they're going to follow them. Now, biblical leaders are going to sacrifice in order to keep the sheep safe. And you hear the stories, David slew, all sorts of critters that were after the sheep. But basically, it's, keeping the sheep safe. Got to ensure the well-being of the sheep. Make sure that they've got a place, where they can graze. You got to find them the still water. Sheep won't drink out of fast-moving water. That's why in Psalm it says, you lead me beside the still waters. They won't drink out of fast-moving water. You got to find something still for them to drink. Scares them, I guess. Sheep are pretty timid. It doesn't take a whole lot to scare a sheep.
They ran alongside it.
Have you ever seen those goats on YouTube? If you scare them, then they pass out.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, they fall over.
Oh yeah, fainting goats or whatever. Yeah, I'd forgotten about that one. Yeah.
So you're the one. And you got a what?
Yeah, she got the 93.
Oh, I love it.
And of course, the other thing to remember is that we're all sheep. There's really only one true leader. And even if you're a biblical leader, you're still the under shepherd to the great shepherd, the good shepherd.
Choose today whom you shall follow.
Mm-hmm.
It just popped into my head because Jesus is in front of us, we're following him. Or we can choose not to follow him and,
Right.
yeah, you don't want to know where that goes.
So, yeah, that's something to remember, that we're all sheep. When the conventional leaders, when they get to a certain point, they figure they don't have to answer to anybody. No matter what position you have when you're doing biblical leadership, you're always answering to God. That's the thing that we always remember. So we always have somebody that we're answering to. And in fact, if you look, at the scripture, it says, that those who lead and those who teach are actually held to a higher standard,
Says that in James.
which scares the heck out of me.
Those who are
As some more,
will be I don't want the word's not judged. Will be
held to a higher standard.
we are responsible. Those of us
Yeah.
who are leading and teaching are responsible for that person's salvation. That was
Yeah.
my favorite scripture.
Yeah.
Because I used to like to look at other preachers and the ones that are on TV and stuff, and I'm like, are you kidding me? That's what you're telling your flock? Well, you're sending your flock straight to hell. And now I can't think of who it was, but it was somebody who was, very popular.
So that's the thing that we have to recall. And again, unfortunately, we have seen cases where there have been people that were claiming to be biblical leaders have forgotten the fact that they're still a sheep and have done things that harmed the sheep and got themselves in all sorts of trouble too. So that's kind of an overview of where we're going to be taking this particular class. So at this point in time, we'll take a short break and then we'll do lesson 2.
What?
Did you say test?
No, I said.
Yeah, Anita, it's time to take a
My brain is just like, I'm heading for the door. I'm out of